Yep, okay, I think we're good.
We'd like to begin by acknowledging that we present this program from the traditional lands of the Cowlitz peoples. We ask that those in attendance reflect on the traditional lands that you inhabit, to pay respect to the original stewards of this land, and to recognize their continuing connection to these lands. Sasha LaPointe is from the Upper Skagit and Nooksack Indian tribe. Native to the Pacific Northwest, she draws inspiration from her coastal heritage as well as her life in the city. She writes with a focus on trauma and resilience, ranging topics from PTSD, sexual violence, the work her great-grandmother did for the Lushootseed language revitalization, to loud basement punk shows and what it means to grow up mixed heritage. With strange obsessions revolving around Twin Peaks, the Seattle music scene, and Coast Salish salmon ceremonies, Sasha explores her own truth of Indigenous identity in the Coast Salish territory. Her memoir, Red Paint, the ancestral autobiography of a Coast Salish punk, was published by Counterpoint Press on March 8, 2022. Her collection of poetry, Rose Quartz, was published by Milkweed in spring 2023. We'd like to thank the Longview Library Foundation for providing the funding for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. Walapu to Ishan as Chaltu, CEO, CIA, Takshablu, Seedsta, Twal Nooksack, Twal Skagit. Hello, welcome everyone. It is an honor to be here with you all. My name is Sasha Takshablu LaPointe, and I am from Nooksack and Upper Skagit. I'm gonna time myself, so I'm not that guy, you know. No favorites. I'm gonna do a reading. I thought about reading from Red Paint, which I've done, and I got more excited to read like new stuff. So hopefully y'all are down for that, but I'm happy to answer. We'll leave time for a Q&A if folks are interested. Please ask me anything you want to about Red Paint. I'm just excited about the new collection of essays called Thundersong, that's coming out in March. And so I thought I'd read an essay about Indigenous kinships and friendships, because as a Native writer, a new Native writer, they're so important to me, these friendships that span oceans. So I think that's all I need to say about it. And if there's time, I also have one intense poem that I might finish with, but we'll see. Also, if you were at my workshop earlier, I drink a lot of water. That's what I have to do, stay calm. I get dry mouth. So it's weird. We drink water together. But thank you so much. I want to thank the library for hosting me. Thank you, Chris, and everyone at the college. This has been a really cool visit. This is a piece from Thundersong called Kinships, and it's in 2 parts. Kinships. Part 1, Habu. Kinship, noun, blood relationships, similar, sharing of characteristics or origins. Gecko, Hawaii. My great-grandmother brought me a gift once when I was still small enough to climb into her lap and paw at her glasses like an animal. I was like that. I was needy, always hungry and clawing, applauding her every syllable. My grandmother was a storyteller, and this made her godly. When other kids played, I stayed in, laid out at her feet, body yawning like a cat. I was listening. You'd think this meant I was a good kid, but my intention was self-serving. You see, I was afraid of ever missing anything she might have said to me. We were taught traditionally to say habu at the end of a story. This was to show that you were listening. But every time I clapped, it was habu, another story. Habu, keep talking. Habu, never leave me. When my great-grandmother went to Hawaii, I was awash of grief and mystery. She was working on language, on preservation, because something I hadn't even been aware of was disappearing. She brought back photos of landscapes lush and green, had seen inside volcanoes, the earth cracked open and burning. I bit my tongue, wrung with worry that she might again leave me. I was selfish that way. The day she brought me a foam gecko on a wire, she had to show me how it worked. I didn't get it at first. I have always been a slow learner. But when the neon green thing began to dance and follow her, I was lost in enchantment, spellbound by my great-grandmother who had found even more magic. For days, the gecko shadowed me. We trampled the house, the sidewalk, the yard, parading. But when it started to disintegrate, leaving parts of its dismembered body all over the carpet, I picked them up one by one, held them together with tape, but soon it was too late, and all that remained was the wire, clinging to a soft chunk of its face. It thudded at the ground behind me in a tragic display. I didn't know at the time I was mourning, so I crawled into my great-grandmother's lap, wailing, begging for her to bring him back to me, to save anything from ever disappearing. And she hushed me as I cried, as I tried to be brave. She smiled and rocked me gently as I repeated the only traditional word I knew. Habu, 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 another story. This was one of Vi's favorite places. Grandma Vi's friend placed another grainy photograph down on the mosaic of snapshots we've been building across the tabletop after dinner. It's been 10 years since the story of our grandmother changed, since it became a grief story, a story about missing something, a story about loss. I looked down at the photo, grandma, black blouse, amber skirt against volcanic rock, beads of coral around her neck, arms up, smiling as a wave crashed beyond her small frame, leaving her haloed in white water. Here's another. The woman, who was more like family and less like one of Grandma's language students, laid the photo down. I looked at our grandmother, locked in some moment in the early 90s. She was still smiling, arm outstretched over a pond as she scattered breadcrumbs, ducks circling for the feeding frenzy. This was my great-grandmother, an ocean away. This was her, the visual evidence of her. Before, all I could ever do was imagine. When I was small, I imagined her there across the ocean on the island of Hawaii. She would bring me and my cousins little gifts, proof that she had stood on volcanoes, swam in warm oceans, and visited ancient places that had nothing to do with us, our lineage, our post-Salish history, but she returned again and again. She made the same trip over the years, despite my great-grandfather refusing to accompany her. He couldn't go back. He carried the weight of Pearl Harbor on his shoulders. He was haunted by the vast Pacific. So year after year, Grandma returned alone, or accompanied by a friend, like the friend who sat with me now over dinner, sharing old photographs of Grandma's favorite places on the island. It felt like a key to a door, a key that had long gone missing. I knew that she had gone almost every year. I knew that it had something to do with the university, with her language work. In the photos, she is full of joy. She is in awe of everything around her. She is caught mid-laugh with a Hawaiian woman on the side of the lava desert. That was a dear friend of Vi's, she tells me. And suddenly, I am racked with grief. I am missing the woman who named me, who helped raise me, who bestowed on me such a weight. When my great-grandmother's friend said goodbye to me that night, she sent me off with some photos and a map of the Big Island. On it, she had marked beaches and trails, the university in Hilo, a city of refuge, and an old Japanese restaurant where Grandma went whenever she was working on that side of the island. She loved to feed the ducks there. Grandma's friend was warm when she told me this, lost in some memory of meals in the duck pond. I thanked her as we embraced and said goodbye. She told me to have a good trip, and I was grateful for her time, for these photos and places laid out like a treasure map, one that I believed held the key to getting back to her, my namesake, our grandmother. This would be my second trip to the Big Island. I had been reluctant to make the first journey of the previous year. I felt uncomfortable traveling to an island so recently impacted by the forces of colonization. What right do I have to be there? I asked my partner when he presented me with this invitation. When I saw the reports of the impact of tourism, the masses of well-to-do white families that crashed the small communities like tidal waves and ravaged the resources, I couldn't reconcile the guilt I felt, couldn't explain to my white partner who had been raised there. When I finally agreed to go, I felt ashamed. As a Native woman, it's sometimes hard for me to take up space in places that remind me so blatantly of our history. That first trip to the Big Island was short, just a few days between work to meet his family and to see where he grew up. What I remember most is stepping off the plane into the open air of the Kona airport. I closed my eyes and felt an unexpected wave of familiarity wash over me. Something about the floral sweet air, the hot asphalt beneath my feet, the sunlight as it poured in over the old luggage carousel, the soft whirring mellow noise as it turned, all of it felt like someplace I had been before. This happens sometimes. A memory that doesn't feel like mine saturates my senses, and I call my mother. I knew that Grandma had come to Hawaii throughout my life, but I didn't know the details, on which islands she had spent the most time. When my mom picked up the phone, she laughed gently. No, it wasn't deja vu, she said. No, I wasn't crazy. The Big Island was the island Grandma came to most. It was where she did the most language work, where she grew friendships, where she returned to again and again. This was her favorite island. I hadn't known it before. This new information led me to seek out our family friends when I returned home. I had questions. I had felt my great-grandmother's presence so strongly in that airport and across the winding roads that led us away from the town along the coastline and even in deep South Kona where my partner grew up. I knew that before I went back to that place, I would have to get more of the story. When I spent the evening with my great-grandmother's friend, she told stories of their shared adventures. It felt like time travel, like I could somehow reach her in places that meant so much to her. And so, a year later, with my new stack of photos and the 20-year-old map tucked under my arm, I returned to the Big Island, excited by the opportunity to retrace my great-grandmother's steps. I was comforted by the places I knew she had stood. I followed the same trails she had walked, and every time I left a coil of hair in the dirt or the sand, I was speaking to her. I became quite emotional, and some days I'd spend the long car rides across the island quiet, enveloped in memory, in language and story. As my partner made the long treks from Honoka'a to Waimea, I'd rest my head on the window, staring out at the street names as they passed by. Almost every street in Hawaii is written in the traditional language, the towns and the highways too. I began to understand what brought my great-grandmother back every year. Here is a place where on any given radio station, you can hear the traditional language. You see it on signs and storefronts. It's loud and powerful, reverberating across the island like a song, and she could hear it. I think she felt inspired by it. Like some part of her knew that she had to give her own language a fighting chance. Back on the continent, traditional languages are less known, buried by years of cultural erasure and colonization. When she was young, Grandma began to notice that the last fluent elders of her tribe were passing, and with them, her language was on the brink of extinction. I often wondered how she became so tenacious, so bold in her mission to keep our Lushootseed language in this world, how she transcribed and created a written language that's always been so mesmerizing to me. When I think of her in the 1970s and 80s, already a grandmother, I often wonder how she found the determination to keep going, even in the face of colonialism, racism, and forces that wish to erase her. On those long drives across Hawaii, it became obvious to me that coming here guided her, pushed her forward. Perhaps it was here that she found the strength and the will to not let our language fade into silence. One photo of my grandma in Hawaii is of her and a friend I didn't know. Her smile is big and radiant as she stands mid-lap next to a Hawaiian woman. I know from her language student that this woman had a profound impact on my grandmother, that the two were both storytellers and language teachers and remained friends over the years. When they met, they were already grandmothers, and looking down at the photo, the two could be sisters. I have wondered about the possibility of seeking out the descendants of my great-grandmother's friend to ask them questions, to see if they remember. Something about this friendship moved me, how it spanned oceans and decades, how in each other the two found a kindred spirit, found a connection, a kinship. Part 2, Canoe Journey. Canoe, noun, a light, narrow boat propelled by paddling. On my most recent trip to the Big Island, I sat on a beach while my partner surfed. He had left me a snorkel mask and encouraged me to swim out along the reef if I got too hot, saying there would most likely be sea turtles out at this time of day. Instead, I sat in the blistering heat, notebook in my lap, as I filled its pages with poetry. I wrote about the small blue church ahead of me and how it seemed out of place at the water's edge. I wrote about the duck pond at Neo's, about how when no one was looking, I leaned the weight of my body against a coconut tree and cried. About how my friends chatted somewhere behind me, how I stood on the sponge-soft grass along the pond, directly where my great-grandmother once stood, content and smiling as she tossed bread. I looked at the ducks circling, granddaughter ducks, maybe. I wrote it all down, how my partner had taken me on grandma's tour of the Big Island twice now, how I think I fell in love with him more each day, with every story he told, how he learned Hawaiian words in kindergarten, how he understood at a young age that he was a guest on this island. I relaxed the wall I had learned to construct around my heart, specifically around white men who have the capacity to banish things. He told me stories of schoolyard fights, and how he learned to be quiet, how to behave on a land that doesn't belong to you. You'd get pounded for that, he'd say, about boys in his grades who came from California and tried to take up too much space. Posted up on the beach as he surfed, I felt grateful for him. I was grateful for the quiet, the solitude. He knew the stories that looped in my head, and he knew how badly I needed to quiet them down. I wrote poems for my grandmother, for my ancestors. I wrote poems about land back, about decolonization and cultural revitalization. I wrote a poem about salmon for my friend Kay because the sun and the beach made me miss her. Kay and I met when she was visiting from New Zealand. She was on her West Coast book tour and stayed with me at my home in Tacoma. We had done several book festivals and readings together. And in her, I found a kindred spirit. Together, we showed up at author after parties, feeling awkward and out of place. We showed up in lace and latex, in boots and lip gloss, hovering over the snacks, wondering if it was just us, or were the other writers not talking to us? Maybe they're just scared of us. Indigenous women writers. And we laughed and filled our plates with free fish and drank Chardonnay before taking a lift back to the punk club. We did oyster shooters in Port Townsend, and when I showed her a Coast Salish carving, she whipped around to show me the back of her sweatshirt adorned in Maori art. Look at the similarities. And we both smiled, because of course there were similarities. On her last week in the Pacific Northwest, Tay visited my class at the Native Pathways program at Evergreen State College. The students lit up in her presence, ignited by her laugh, her words, and the simple way she spoke truth about indigeneity, trauma, feminism, resilience. Out on the stairwell, we both took puffs off our nicotine vapes. It's exhausting, being inspiring. So goth. Yeah.
Really fitting.
I know, I love that. It was about to like, It was exhausting, being inspiring, being strong. As we puffed clouds of strawberry and mango out into the northwest drizzle, Tay broke the quiet rhythm of inhale, exhale. What's that? She asked, and her head tilted toward a large wooden structure ahead of us. I admitted I didn't know. It looks Maori, she responded. So together we trekked down into the rain, down the stairs, and up to the building. The weaving studio was a collaboration between two Native artists. One was Salish, the other Maori. We approached the building exchanging glances. The woodwork that adorned the structure was half her culture and half mine. There were figures in the wood. It was hard to distinguish the different styles, the overlap in our tribe's aesthetics. We circled the studio in opposite directions, eyeing the story carved in both Maori and Lushootseed. Even the figures of the pillars shared the same abalone eyes. We met in the middle. It's us, my friend exclaimed. This building is us. And as we embraced, we laughed. We wiped tears from our eyes. That same week, we were invited to a screening of a documentary, Salmon People, was a film made by Native activists and followed the story of Coast Salish people's fight to save our rivers and waterways, to save our salmon. Tay and I spent the evening thronged in a passionate conversation. We spoke excitedly about the different ways Indigenous activism and cultural revitalization were taking shape, even in our own communities that seemed worlds apart, separated by oceans, yet remained so intrinsically connected. The day after the documentary, Tay and I walked with a friend in Swan Creek. She wanted to see the forest, the woods that were so much a part of me. We walked altered. We had ingested a small amount of hallucinogenic mushrooms with care and intention to lift the veil if we could. We wanted to commune with our ancestors. On the trails, we both noticed the same faces in the trees, climbed the same log that stretched over the creek because we thought we had seen something. We talked about the salmon returning, how that documentary had given us hope. Then, before leaving the woods that day, as we stepped carefully across the stream bed, we saw it there. We both looked immediately up at each other. Were we really seeing this? Was this here? In the dry creek bed along the stones, like it had just unearthed itself, was the smallest fish I had ever seen. We screamed when we realized what it was, a perfectly intact fish, not rotten or bloodied or hooked, its scales rainbowing silver in the daylight. What was it doing here? How did it get here? We puzzled over the logic as we made our way up the trail. When we reached my house, we both Googled it. The small fish had indeed been a salmon. We talked about spirits and ancestors through the rest of the hike. We talked about them bringing us together. We had wanted proof that as their descendants, as their granddaughters, we could see change in our lifetime. The salmon appeared to us, and for a moment, I wasn't sure it was real. I questioned it. But days later, I walked the trail alone. After she was gone, the fish was still there, still fresh and silver. On her last day, I took Tay to my uncle's carving studio. He was restoring a canoe in preparation for our annual canoe journey. Together, we climbed up into the boat. She told me how her ancestors also traveled by canoe, how they were carvers. We both come from water people, she told me. And in the canoe, we felt a kinship. My uncle shouted, paddles up, and we held them tight. We smiled as we snapped a photo. We talked about the meaning of the canoe journey, how different tribes come together and paddle. This is a Coast Salish tradition, one that happens every year. It's about togetherness, community, and strength. Tay and I both got emotional when we said goodbye later that day. We hugged hard and long and cried. I hadn't realized how much I needed a friend like that. Another new writer, someone who understood, who felt worried for the world, who worried for Indigenous communities, and I begged her to come back next summer, to come to canoe journeys with me. Like the unexplainable salmon in the dry creek bed, another strangely magical thing happened a week after Tay left my home. Another writer, one whom I recently had the privilege of interviewing for a lecture series, called me out of the blue. Julian is an Indigenous human rights lawyer, an environmentalist rights lawyer, and he's of the Chamorro people, the Indigenous people of Guam. The two of us met briefly and formed an immediate kinship. He was writing a review of Tay's book. How incredible, he had remarked when we first met, that she would be sent to me, that he was working on her review. What are the odds? And we both laughed. Small world, small, indigenous, brighter world. Julian called out of the blue to ask if I would do him a favor. Anything, I responded. He asked if I would carry over 100,000 signatures of petition he was spearheading and deliver it to the Amazon headquarters in Seattle. The petition was to protest the sacred lands of a tribe in South Africa, a piece of land that Amazon was trying to develop. Without hesitation, I agreed. I wore my cedar woven hat. I drove to downtown Seattle and met with the crew of activists Julian had put me in touch with. I was terrified and powerful at the same time. When the doors to the Amazon building opened and the man in the suit, some slightly higher up, greeted me, I made him listen to me, listen to the speech I had prepared. I handed him the signatures, and I was proud in that moment that I could partake, at least in some small way, in the protection of sacred land and indigenous land. As I sat writing poems about all of this, I let myself smile. I relaxed. I looked at the small blue church, angular and out of place, glaring at me through the afternoon sun. The church was a structure built by missionaries, by a group of people not of this land, but who wished to gain control over it. When I let this imagery, the evidence of a colonized world, start to squeeze around my belly like a rubber band, I try and remember my friend's face as we sat together in that canoe. I hear Julian's voice as he asked me to go boldly into the heart of the city and protest the development of sacred tribal lands across the world. I let these images take shape in me. I let them push me forward through the weight of it, like a paddle slicing through water. I watched as my partner began to paddle in from the lineup. The sun glittered along the surface, and I looked down towards the hotels. I could see the crowded buildings that hugged the coastline, the resorts and shops in the distance. The second year my great-grandmother came to Hawaii, she happened to be in one of those shops. By chance, she ran into her friend, the woman from the photo. She was delighted to see the woman who inspired her from her previous trip, her first trip. Out of all of the shops on the island, they both walked into this one. Grandma didn't believe this was a coincidence. My partner was nearly to shore. I looked again towards Kona, the heart of downtown, already buzzing to the hum of tourists anxious for white sand beaches and blue Hawaiian cocktails. People who had traveled here from the Midwest, from Sweden, and places even further would soon pour out of the hotels and condos onto the small roads and beaches. I thought about how they would walk without thinking next to sacred places, ancient and powerful places. They will pass by sacred spaces on their way to spots called snorkel bobs and magic sands. I smiled when I remembered the white sand beach I stood on earlier that day, how my friend, Kalei, a native Hawaiian living here, back on her traditional land, learning her traditional language and hula and chanting, was able to tell me when I asked, but what is this beach really called? Because the painted sign read Magic Sands. Kalei smiled and laughed a big laugh because she understood my need to know. Well, it's not called Magic Sands. And we both howled with laughter because we were used to this kind of thing, the colonial tradition of giving names to places already named. But when Kalei told me the tourist packed beach was once called La'aloa, I felt a heaviness in my heart, a desire to undo erasure, to erase every letter that was ever painted over a place that was already there. It means very sacred, Kalei added, and hugged me immediately on the beach. Kalei's language teacher is the daughter of Lulana, my great-grandmother's first friend in Hawaii. I remember the photo of the two women taken over 30 years ago, and I thought of Kalei, our chance meeting. I thought of my new friends, the photos we would have together. I thought of the kinships we were nurturing, the ways we will learn from each other in the future, the fact that we'll always make this trip as long as I'm able to. My partner climbed up the rocks where I sat. I watched as he wrung out his hair. He had had a good surf session. He smiled when he saw that I hadn't even gotten into the water, despite the heat. I was busy writing, I told him, he nodded and sat next to me. He looked around, then back at me. Did you know you were sitting on an ancient Hawaiian canoe launch? He said, and I guessed. I looked ahead of me, at my bag, at my notebook, the unused snorkel mask. I studied the black rock formations, the steps that led down into the water just beyond my bare feet. I nearly cried. Of course I was. I closed my eyes and saw my great-grandmother's face. I let a few strands of hair coil around my fingertips, and I gently pushed the offering into the cracked rock. Seed, seed, I said. I kept my eyes on the water ahead and spoke the Lashutsi word for thank you. Thank you.
You have, where you read it?
Oh, I forgot about the poem. I feel like I just read for so long, but I definitely have the poem. And then if folks have questions. The poem is much shorter. Sorry that was so long.
No.
Could you tell me the word for more stories again?
Taboo.
Taboo.
Yeah.
I loved hearing about you and your grandmother's relationship.
Yeah, taboo is keep going and listening. So this is actually my friend who is an incredible poet. It really challenges me to write new shit. Sorry for
No,
share
that's
new
okay.
stuff. You know, there's something about like, oh, this is brand new, so it's brand new. A little disclaimer. So I've been growing up able to visit our grandmother's cedar woven dress that is in Seattle Art Museum. If y'all have been to the Native exhibition there, it's really beautiful. We have a lot of gorgeous pieces, but it's really intense to be a namesake and to go see this glass box. And sometimes I've shown up and I'm like, knock, knock, like, can I have that? Yeah, I have that. I'm gonna to you. So in thinking about that, when I recently was at Seattle Art Museum, revisiting grandma's dress, I wrote this poem. Cedar woven dress at Seattle Art Museum. The year I am born, they carved a maiden from the trunk of an ancient tree. My grandmother does the blessing, dressed in cedar, hands to the sky, feet of the tide, palms up, palms full, story. The maiden marries the sea, becomes ocean and sea kelp for him, a promise of fish returning, a union of abundance to keep her people from starving. I am born lonely, an inheritance of grief and wanting, muscle memory of seashell, and the fear of ever going hungry. For years, we swapped the story. I watched the bones of her cheeks as they starve into barnacle. Everything dies, eventually. I say it out loud to an empty gallery, words echoing museum light against the glass case encased inside the dress, cedar woven and donated. Every day, I present to the shape of her my accomplishments. Everything I've ever done, an offering. Pages, heartbreaks, trophies, degrees, awards, a stillborn. The display creates an illusion of body, ghost-like, the form filling up with nothing. I punch my fist through the glass as the alarm begins screaming. The people have come running from the beach, up the stairs, to see me, torn apart and bleeding. Skin shredded, knuckles open and sparkling as they splinter like rubies in the glass. I drag myself in through the broken opening, clothes torn and ripped, body gutted and glistening like fish. What's left is practically nothing, bone wet and shiny. I crawl inside and the people are surprised when I don't slip into it. The dress, the cedar woven shape of her. They don't understand I never intended to fill it. Instead, a body cut like a promise, blood ribboning, I curl into her would-be arms, like a baby, like I used to be. the memory of being held by something, like oceans, like language, like story, like grandmothers and whales and maidens who give themselves up freely to the deep, to keep their people from ever going hungry. Thank you.
I think you should take questions if you'd like, but I'm gonna shut off the recording so that the